The late summer sun beat down hard on Colorado territory in 1885. Red dust coated the dirt road, dry wind lashing against the cracked wooden siding of the Carter house. Inside the small room, the air was so thick you could taste its weight. Miriam Carter stood there, her shoulders trembling beneath a faded gray dress worn thin with use. Her hands hung loose at her sides, fingers calloused from years of washing and mending. The dark brown of her sun-hardened skin had drained to a pale ash, lips pressed tight as if holding back a sob. Across from her, her mother's voice cracked like glass. 2 years a wife and not a single child. Folks say my daughter is nothing but a leech, useless. Her father sat heavy in a wooden chair by the corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her like a nail. You came back empty-handed. No dowry, no child, just a failed shadow. Miriam tightened her fists. She had tried to speak when they pulled her from the wagon 2 weeks earlier, after her former husband's family had tossed her aside like a broken tool. But they hadn't wanted her words then, just as they didn't now. They wanted proof of worth. A child. Nothing else. Her mother turned, muttering under her breath, then spun back, eyes flaring. They're talking in church, you know. Your ex-husband's family threw a party after casting you off, celebrating that they'd rid themselves of a barren woman. He's got another girl already, young, full of life, can bear him a brood. Miriam shook her head, but her voice died beneath her father's shout. Silence! No one cares for excuses. That ruined womb of yours is all people remember. A woman who can't bear a child is a dry well, fit for nothing, thrown away and no one mourns. Her mother stepped forward and shoved a folded letter into Miriam's hand. Daniel Holt, she hissed through her teeth. He's got land, cattle, lives alone out past the border. He needs someone to cook, tend, mend fences. We agreed. You'll go to him. In exchange, this family's debt is cleared. Miriam stared at the paper. No greeting, no promise, just a contract. You're selling me off? Her voice rasped, as if her breath had betrayed her. Her father let out a bitter laugh. You think we can feed another useless shadow? You're not a daughter. You're a burden. The words dropped like stones, snuffing out every other sound. Only the creak of wagon wheels drifted in from the yard. The driver had arrived. He didn't knock, didn't greet. He simply sat waiting for a package to be loaded. Miriam stayed rooted to the floorboards, as if her feet had sprouted roots. Slowly, she picked up the small cloth bag lying in the corner. It had never been unpacked since her return. One thin dress, a few worn underthings, and a frayed Bible with a chipped corner. Will he be at the church? She asked, her voice hollow, not sure who she was speaking to. Her mother gave a cold laugh. He didn't bother to come, just sent the wagon. That tells you enough. Miriam lowered her head and stepped outside, afternoon sun glinting off her tangled black curls. Her father called after her, not quite cruel but final. Don't come back. The wheels rolled, kicking up a red cloud. The road stretched wide and empty. Miriam sat silent in the wagon bed, hands cold though the sun burned hot. She didn't cry. The tears had long dried. What remained was emptiness, as if she herself had ceased to be. Darkness crept over the land. Miriam sat rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. In her palm, she clutched the battered Bible, the only thing left to remind her she still had a soul, even if the world had marked her as nothing but a debt to be paid. The wagon left, its wheels rattling into the distance. and Miriam stood alone before the gray wooden gate of Holt Ranch. Dusk had settled. The last streak of light caught at the foot of the hills, casting the lone cabin in a deep purple shadow. A low bellow carried from the far pasture, joined by wind sweeping through the pines, sharp with the promise of a long night. She clutched the strap of her small cloth bag and stepped toward the porch. The door opened at her knock. A man filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, sleeves rolled to the elbow on a faded shirt, dust and sun still clinging to him. His face bore the marks of field and weather, darkened and hard, eyes deep as a well, unreadable, whether cold or simply used to silence. He regarded her for a long beat, then spoke in a low, rough tone. "Rooms at the end of the hall, left side." No greeting, no explanation. That was all. He stepped aside and Miriam entered, trailing the scent of dust and late sun across her worn dress. The door closed behind her, leaving stale coffee and tobacco smoke heavy in the air, the kind that clung to empty rooms. Her quarters were bare to the bone. A rough bedstead, sheets faded thin, one flat pillow. Miriam set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. Moonlight slipped through the narrow pane, striking her face and laying bare tired eyes that fought to keep calm. That night she did not sleep. Only the heavy beat of her own heart marked her stillness, reminding her she was, at least, still alive. At dawn she rose. The kitchen lay abandoned, pans crusted, grease-hardened yellow on the table. She built a fire, the smell of wood and cornmeal carrying the first hint of warmth into the house. Daniel came in, boots heavy on the boards. He washed at the basin, dried his hands, and sat. "Salt?" he asked, eyes on the plate. She pointed to the shelf. He nodded once. Nothing more. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of tin spoons. When the meal was done, he shrugged into his coat. At the door, he said flatly, "East Corral fence ain't finished. Leave me a plate." The days that followed blurred into labor. Miriam moved like a shadow, sweeping corners, washing bedding in the creek, chopping wood, milking, cooking. Her hands, already rough, cracked and bled from the cold water. She bound them with torn cloth, hidden under sleeves. Daniel worked the land from dawn till dark, ate without comment, then shut himself away. Their words never stretched beyond short exchanges. "Horse? In the stall." Or "Door's loose. I'll mend it." Yet now and then she felt his eyes pause on her, not with scorn or pity, but something quieter, passing. Like the morning she wrung a wool sweater in icy water, knuckles bleeding raw, and he stood on the porch, gaze flicking down before turning away. Or the evening she set stew on the table, and his glance brushed the red mark on her wrist, fleeting, but enough to stir something she had forgotten, her own pulse. Once a gust snapped a wet cloth across her face as she pinned laundry. She lifted her head and saw him just home from the field, stripping gloves, wiping sweat from his brow. Their eyes caught. His held no message, yet heat rushed into her cheeks. She turned quickly, fastening pins with trembling fingers, her unease lingering until sundown. The days left little space to think. But at night, in her bare room, staring at swollen, split hands, truth pressed in. She was not a wife here, not a partner, only a debt settled. Lying back on the faded sheets, Miriam whispered into the dark, as though even she should not hear it. "I am no longer a wife, only a debt." Her words dissolved into the stillness, leaving the hollow ache to spread, sharp and cold beneath her ribs. Autumn came quietly to Colorado, a thin chill seeping through every crack in the wooden walls. At dawn, fog clung to the grasslands and the air held the faint tang of wood smoke. Miriam rose early as always, her hands numbed by the creek's water as she scrubbed clothes. The dark skin of her fingers split and bled, red lines marking years of wear. She did not complain. Complaints had never earned her anything but contempt. But that morning, when she returned to the kitchen, she stopped short. On the rough-hewn table sat a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. The house was empty, save for the distant whinny of a horse. Heart-thudding, she opened it. Inside lay a pair of soft leather gloves, dark brown, cut to fit a woman's hands. Miriam stared, caught between disbelief and caution. No one ever thought to ease her pain. Yet today, someone had. Slowly she slipped them on. The leather embraced her cracked skin, warm and tender where she was raw. For a moment, her hands felt like they belonged to someone whole again. She looked up, and Daniel was in the doorway, a small axe in hand. His eyes flicked once to the gloves, a glance that lingered only long enough to confirm. Then he gave a slight nod and turned away. The door shut, leaving Miriam with her trembling hands and the sudden ache of something stirring deep within her chest. The days that followed brought more quiet offerings, as if sparks lit one by one in the dark. One night, weary to her bones, Miriam found a clean handkerchief folded on her pillow. The fabric was new, unwashed, clumsy white stitches forming her initials, MC. The threads were uneven, but she knew they had been sewn by rough hands, not a woman's. She pressed the cloth to her face, breathing in the faint scent of tobacco and pine. Warmth slid through her, blurring her eyes. Another day, by the wash basin, she discovered a small jar wrapped in brown paper. Inside was salve sharp with mint. When she spread it across her cracked skin, cool relief spread through her hands. Looking up, she saw Daniel in the yard, splitting wood. He never turned, never asked, but she knew it was his doing. She did not speak of it, did not dare offer thanks. The silence was fragile, too easily broken. Instead, Miriam treasured the gifts in secret, hoarding them like a child might cling to crumbs. The world beyond the ranch, however, was not so kind. One morning, Daniel took her into town for flour, salt, and cloth. Inside the store, eyes followed her like needles. By the flour sacks, two women leaned close, their whispers sharp enough to cut. "Is that her? The one they sent back?" "Yes. Couldn't bear a child. Husband cast her off. Now she's just Holt's drudge. Who'd want that?" Laughter snapped like a whip. Miriam kept her head down, fingers white around the basket. She said nothing, as she always had, swallowing the same poison she'd once endured in her husband's house. That evening, dust coated her old brown shoes. She left them by the door. After their meal of silence, she returned for them and paused. The leather gleamed, scrubbed clean. No word was spoken. But Miriam knew, and her heart gave a startled beat. Piece by piece, the signs stitched themselves together. A pair of gloves, a stitched cloth, a jar of balm, shoes wiped clear of dust. No one claimed them, no one named them, yet they bore a weight she had never known. Care without demand, without scorn, without bargain. One late afternoon, Miriam sat in the kitchen, flexing her fingers inside the gloves. Daniel passed, his shadow long across the floor. His gaze touched the gloves, then her. He gave another of those small nods. That was all. Yet in that instant, Miriam felt her heart tilt, unsteady. That night, she laid the gloves beside her pillow, folded the stitched cloth at the bed's edge, tucked the balm into the drawer. They were proof, however small, that someone had seen the pain she hid. Lying down, Miriam whispered into the dark, voice shaking, as if confessing to herself, "Perhaps I am not only a debt." And with that thought, she closed her eyes, carried at last into sleep, her first untroubled rest in years, unshadowed by cruel words. Winter edged closer to the prairie. Bitter winds swept down from the mountains, slipping through cracks in the wood and carrying the scent of far-off snow. Miriam wrapped another layer of cloth around her shoulders, yet nothing eased the cold inside her chest. Many nights she lay on the worn sheets, dragged backward into the past, into a house she had once called home. In memory, she smelled the sharp bitterness of herbal brews her mother-in-law had forced upon her each morning. The woman believed Miriam's body was the reason her son had no heir, and so thrust roots, powders, and dark potions into her hands. Some days the cramps bent her double, but her pain was met only with a cold stare. "If you want to stay in this house, you must do the one thing a woman is for." Month after month, red marks on the calendar came and went, each one turning her husband's indifference into disdain. Her mother-in-law's voice cut sharper than any whip. "Barren. Other daughters-in-law bear 3 children, and you're nothing but a dry well." The words cut deeper than blows, and Miriam swallowed them like poison, silent as the bitterness burned her throat. That night, her dreams dragged her back to that kitchen, the flicker of oil lamps, the echo of shouted curses against the walls. "Barren! Useless!" She bolted upright in the dark, sweat beading her brow, chest heaving. The Holt ranch room was still, but her body trembled as if she had just endured a beating. Fingers clutched the blanket, eyes wide until the truth sank in. She was elsewhere now. No one stood over her to condemn. At first crowing light, Miriam buried herself in work, desperate to shake off the shadows. But fate pressed harder. The chicken pen burst into chaos, wings flapping, straw flying, squawks ringing sharp. She lunged, trying to close the gate, to drive them back inside, but she was too slight, too worn. Breathless, she dropped to the dirt, shoulders shuddering. It was not the cry of a young girl begging comfort, but the silent collapse of a woman who had borne too much shame. No sound escaped, only her shaking shoulders, her hands twisted together, exhaustion carved into every line of her body. She did not know Daniel was there, standing just beyond the fence. He did not stride forward, did not demand an explanation. He simply stood, still as a post, letting his presence steady the air instead of crowding it. Wind tugged at his coat, blew his hair back, but his gaze held steady, fixed on her without judgment. At last his voice broke the silence, low, even, neither command nor pity. "Need a few days' rest?" Miriam lifted her head. Her eyes were red, her hands stained with dirt. For a heartbeat, she braced for the rebuke she had always known. But Daniel's look was different. Not the cold weight of being deemed broken, nor the scrutiny she had grown to expect. His gaze was plain, dry as dust, yet beneath it lay something rare. Acknowledgement. She shook her head, lips parting without sound. Daniel did not insist. He gave a single nod and turned away, leaving her space enough to draw a long breath. For the first time in years, someone had granted her the right to falter without penalty, the right to sink down into the earth and not be branded a burden. That night, Miriam lingered at her window, moonlight spilling silver across the yard. His question still echoed. Need a few days' rest? Words no one had ever spoken to her. Not mercy, she knew. Daniel was not a man given to displays, but it had been a touch all the same, proof she was not entirely unseen. She pressed the stitched cloth with her initials against her cheek and closed her eyes. The old wounds still throbbed. Memories still bit into her sleep. But here at least, in this place, she was not forced to prove her worth. And for Miriam, that small piece was enough to carry her into another day. The little town at the foot of the hill was busier than usual on market day. Wagons clattered, iron rims screeching against gravel. Apple sellers shouted their prices. The scent of cinnamon from a baker's stall drifted through the chill of early winter. Miriam held her basket close, moving quickly, her gaze lowered. After months of whispers, she had learned to walk like a shadow. Daniel strode ahead, broad and silent, slipping into the hardware store for tools. He did not speak, nor glance back, but his long steps slowed just enough for her to keep pace. Miriam paused at the well, breathing deep against the din. The noise pressed against her temples. She gripped the handle of her basket and told herself that once the list was done, she could go home. Then a shout ripped through the square. "James! Stop! James!" A boy no older than 4 stumbled into the main road, legs unsteady on the loose stones, a paper kite tugging wildly in his hand. Up the slope, a timber wagon hurtled downward. Horses panicked, driver hauling at the reins in vain. It all broke in a single heartbeat. Miriam dropped her basket. Her feet moved before thought. Skirts flew, wind slapped her face. She lunged, arms outstretched. The boy turned, eyes round, just as she gathered him in, twisting, rolling them both into the ditch. Hooves thundered past. Wheels screamed, skimming inches away. Dirt and gravel burst into the air. Then silence. Miriam lay gasping, heart hammering, her skirt torn, knees scraped raw, hands bleeding. Yet her arms stayed locked around the child, unwilling to release what she had saved. The boy whimpered against her shoulder, and from somewhere deep, unbidden, words spilled from her lips in a broken whisper. "Mama's here. Mama's got you. Shh. Mama's here." She did not hear herself, did not see how many had heard. But across the street, one man stood frozen. Daniel. He had seen it all. The charge into danger, the desperate embrace. The light that flared in her eyes, fierce and tender, and unbearably sorrowful. His jaw tightened, hand clenching the strap at his side. The child's mother rushed forward, weeping as she fell to her knees, gathering her boy into her arms. Miriam loosened her hold, stroking the child's hair with bloodied fingers, her gaze lingering a moment longer before surrendering him. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with a flicker of shock, as though she had glimpsed a grief too raw to name. "Thank you. God bless you," she choked out, clutching her son away. Miriam rose slowly, dress dirt-stained, knees burning. She bent to collect her basket from the road. Daniel crossed over and set a hand briefly on her shoulder. Nothing more. Then he moved on. That night her room was hushed but for the wind circling the window. On her bed, beside her pillow, something waited. A wooden doll. Rough but careful. Carved features simple. eyes of black stitches, mouth painted faint red, hair etched in short lines. Miriam sat at the edge, lifting it with trembling hands. Fresh wood still clung to it. The cuts showed the mark of a blade wielded by hands more used to axes than carving. No note lay with it, no word. But she knew who had left it. Her chest constricted. The names hurled at her. Barren, dry well, useless. The bitter tonics forced down. The shame of being cast out. All rose like a flood. She bent forward, clutching the doll to her breast. Tears came hot and unyielding, soaking the rough cloth. She did not sob aloud. Only her shoulders shook, the sound buried inside her chest. Yet the embrace was that of a mother cradling her child, fragile and fierce at once. In that moment, she allowed herself to believe she could still love, still protect, still give a piece of her heart without being condemned. And so a small flame was lit in the dark, quiet, fragile, but enough to warm a corner of a soul long smothered in ashes. The fire roared in the hearth, its golden light dancing across the dark wooden walls. Miriam sat close to the flames, hands folded in her lap, the crackle of burning logs filling the silence. Outside, the wind hissed through the cracks, dragging dry leaves across the ground. Tonight, the cabin felt larger than usual, its emptiness pressing down with every breath. The door swung open, wind sweeping in, and Daniel stepped inside. His coat was heavy with dust, his face harder than usual. Miriam saw at once the rough bandage on his hand, the red stain seeping through, the torn sleeve, the bruise along his cheekbone. She sprang to her feet, heart catching in her throat. Words rose but lodged there, unsaid. Daniel gave no explanation. He only shrugged off his coat, hung it on the hook, and sank into a chair by the fire, his features set tight in the glow. Miriam drew closer. She knew without asking. Somewhere in town, someone had spat the words meant to wound her, words she had lived with all her life. And Daniel, a man of silence, had not stood aside. His injury was proof of it. She did not question. Instead, she turned to the stove, set a pot to simmer. The knife's rhythm on the board, the stir of the spoon, the rising scent of beef with carrots and potatoes filled the room. When she placed the bowl before him, she fed the fire another log, flame flaring to wash across his tired face. His eyes lingered on her longer than they ever had before. That look unsettled her, trembling her heart. She sat opposite him, letting the fire burn away the space between them. He ate slowly, his hand clumsy under the bandage. At last, unable to watch, Miriam reached across, brushing her fingers against his wrapped palm. The cloth was rough beneath her touch, the skin swollen, raw and red beneath. She held lightly, as if her hand alone might soothe the pain. Daniel did not pull back. He let her stay, his gaze steady on her, while the fire snapped between them. When she tried to withdraw, his other hand caught hers. Rough, warm, it covered her fingers like shelter. Tears stung her eyes. For once, she let them show. They sat in the hush, their shadows merging on the wall. Then Daniel spoke, voice low, uncertain, as though groping for light. Do you ever feel you're not alone anymore? Her eyes lifted, shining. She whispered back, fragile as a prayer. I hardly dare believe, but right now I want to. He said nothing more, letting silence carry the truth. Together they leaned, closing the space. Their lips met, not with haste but with acceptance, with the hunger of two souls long starved of gentleness. The kiss was steady, unhurried, yet deep, not lust, but a thirst pressed down too long. Miriam's hands rose to his chest, feeling the thrum of his heart. His arms closed around her, strong yet trembling, the embrace of a man who had denied himself warmth and now could no longer. The firelight painted their figures on the walls, two shapes drawn, close. Outside, the dark pressed in, but within, the heat held them. Miriam felt the heavy armor of shame slip from her shoulders, layer by layer, until she was bare and unafraid. That night they found each other not in vows nor promises, but in the honesty of touch. One kiss lengthened to many. One embrace deepened into breath shared, warmth given. Her body shook, but she did not draw back. He was firm, but gentle, and in that closeness, the night ceased to frighten. When the fire dimmed to embers, Miriam lay curled in his arms, her head against his chest, the rhythm of his heart steady under her ear. Daniel said nothing, only held her tighter, as though vowing without words never to let go. Her eyes closed, a single tear traced d'Honchamp down her cheek, not of shame or sorrow, but of being seen at last, held for no debt, no duty, only herself, and in the fading glow, Miriam understood. The true fire was not in the hearth. It burned in her chest now, a small flame, no longer alone. For days now, Miriam had felt her body falter. Each morning when she rose, the room tilted as if struck by a sudden wind. In the yard, her legs weakened after only a few steps. Foods once familiar betrayed her. The smell of stew sent her stomach twisting. The sight of a simmering pot made her throat tighten. At the creek, scrubbing laundry, she often had to grip a cold stone to keep from collapsing. She told herself it was weather, fatigue, nothing more. Yet deep inside, Miriam knew what thought she was pushing away. That thought flickered like a fragile flame, part hope, part abyss. At times her hand drifted to her belly, only to snatch it back as though fearing someone might see and laugh. Daniel spoke little, but his eyes never missed. One morning, when she staggered while hanging wet cloth, his hand caught her shoulder, steady as oak. Miriam froze, unable to lift her gaze. His voice came even, carrying the weight of a command that would not be debated. "We're going to see the doctor." Fear pressed against her throat. She braced for the words she had always heard. "Your body cannot. You are useless." But Daniel's eyes left no room to retreat. Not an order, but a quiet promise to carry part of her burden. She lowered her head and yielded. The road to town shone white beneath the sun, though Miriam saw it only through a haze. In the wagon she sat folded in on herself, hands clenched, bloodless. Daniel held the reins, gaze fixed ahead, humming a low tune. Not for pleasure, just enough to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. The doctor's office, tucked behind the general store, reeked of sharp disinfectant. A gray-bearded man with kind eyes and a gentle voice asked a few questions, then bent to examine her. Miriam lay rigid, eyes pinned to the ceiling, chest tight. The moments stretched cruelly long. Then the doctor straightened, a soft smile easing the air. "You're not ill, Mrs. Holt. You're expecting." The words struck like a sudden wind, overturning everything. Miriam blinked hard, lips parting but no sound coming. In her ears rose the sneer of her former mother-in-law, Barren, dry well, useless, never dream of being a mother. Her body shook. Tears spilled, not of joy, but of dread. A hand clamped to her mouth, shoulders quaking. No, it can't be, she whispered, her voice fraying to threads. What if I lose it again? What if the curse holds? Daniel sat beside her, silent. He offered no hollow assurances. His rough, scarred hand simply closed over hers, steady and sure. His gaze held no doubt, only a stillness deep enough to believe in. If we lose it, he said, his voice low, steady as the earth after rain, we'll grieve together. He paused, letting the words sink, then added, weight in every syllable. If it holds, we'll welcome it together. Miriam turned, her tear-wet eyes searching his. In his gaze there was no shadow, no scorn, only faith. Faith enough for them both. The tears that fell then were not only of fear, they were for the first time she had not faced the abyss alone. Daniel had placed his hand in hers and shouldered part of her terror, leaving her no longer solitary against the word barren. On the ride home, Miriam sat silent, her palm pressed against her belly, as though afraid the miracle would vanish if she let go. The wagon rattled over fields awash in late light. Daniel kept his eyes forward, but now and then his hand brushed hers, not forcing, only reminding, I am here. Back at the ranch, Miriam lingered on the porch steps. Sunset washed the land in red gold, setting her dark hair aglow like honeyed flame. Her face still held traces of fear, but softened in the light. Daniel came and stood beside her, saying nothing. His presence filled the space between them. She looked up, and in that meeting of eyes, she knew. Even if she could not yet believe for herself, Daniel already did, and perhaps that faith was enough. A small smile touched her lips, not certainty, but hope. Fragile, trembling hope, but enough to light a long night. That morning the sky hung low and gray, clouds pressing down on the fields. Miriam had just set down her basket of eggs when the thunder of hooves reached her ears. Looking up, she saw 3 wagons rolling toward Holt Ranch, dust rising in their wake. And within that haze appeared faces she thought she had left behind forever. Marlin, her former husband, rode in front. He looked thinner, hollowed, but the same proud gleam lingered in his eyes. On the wagon behind him sat Mr. and Mrs. Trask, dressed as if for church, mouths set, eyes sharp with disdain. Curious townsfolk trailed after, gathering at the fence, their whispers rising like a swarm. Miriam froze, the smell of fresh eggs clinging to her hands. Her heart pounded, and memory cut into her like a dull knife. The curses, the exile, the word barren that had branded her soul. The wagons halted in the yard. Mrs. Trask stepped down first, her gaze slicing across the space to Miriam. So here you've been hiding, she said, voice cold as iron. They say you're with child. A pathetic trick to cling to some scrap of dignity, isn't it? The crowd murmured. Miriam's lips trembled, but no sound came. Mr. Trask's voice joined in, gravelly, edged with threat. Don't think you can stain this family's name. Everyone knows you can't bear children. That belly is nothing but a lie. Miriam staggered back a step. In an instant she was once again the woman cast from a wagon, clutching a cloth bag, her own parents bartering her away like debt. Shame's weight pressed hard, bowing her shoulders. But then footsteps came from behind. Daniel strode from the barn, shirt damp with sweat, hay still clinging to his arms. He stopped at her side, broad and unyielding, a wall at her shoulder. His gaze swept over the crowd. No anger, no bluster, just a calm so steady it hushed them. "I heard clear enough," Daniel said, voice low but carrying. "You call my wife a liar?" Mrs. Trask lifted her chin. "Wife? That cast-off? She cannot be with child. She's deceived you." Daniel reached into his shirt pocket. He unfolded a paper, the seal and signature of the town doctor stamped plain in the morning light. "This is the doctor's word," he said, voice even, unwavering. "Miriam Holt, my wife, is with child, over 3 months along." The crowd stirred. Necks craned, whispers broke loose. Some women covered their mouths, men frowned, children stared wide-eyed. The murmur spread like fire through dry grass. Daniel held still, then let his eyes fall square on Marlon. Maybe the fault was never hers. The words struck like stones. The square fell silent, every eye turning toward Marlon. His face flushed red, then drained pale, his jaw clenched, gaze sliding away. Mr. Trask's hands gripped the wagon rail, white-knuckled. Mrs. Trask faltered, lips quivering but speechless. From the edge of the crowd, a voice rose. "So it wasn't her after all." Another answered, "Marlon's been remarried near 2 years now, and still no children." The gossip swelled, fast and fierce. The stares once fixed on Miriam now cut toward the Trasks. They had come to shame, but instead dragged their own shadow into the light. Miriam stood rigid, heart racing, ears ringing. For years she had carried the weight alone, branded, cursed, and in a handful of steady words, Daniel had lifted it from her shoulders, setting it back where it belonged. The Trasks turned, retreating under the storm of whispers. Marlon kept his head low, thin shoulders sagging, his silence heavier than any protest. The wagons rolled away in dust, not proud, but fleeing in disgrace. The yard quieted. Neighbors drifted off, the murmur fading. Miriam had not moved. Her shoulders, long bowed beneath humiliation, felt lighter. The spring wind brushed across her hair, and for the first time she felt it did not bow her down. Daniel's hand came to rest lightly on her back. No words, only a touch. Miriam closed her eyes and drew in a long breath. The ghosts had returned to haunt her, but when they passed, she found herself unburdened. The last dark door had finally swung shut. Spring rain fell in a fine mist, leaving a thin film of mud along the town's dirt roads, hoofprints and wagon tracks stamped deep into the earth. The market still bustled with apples, spice cakes, and damp wool, but the air carried a different charge. Since the day the Trasks slunk away from Holt Ranch in disgrace, the current of gossip had shifted like water finding a new course. No longer did people whisper, "Miriam is barren." Instead, new words slipped through the streets. Maybe it was never her fault. Marlon's been wed 2 years now, still no child. The whispers that once cut Miriam to pieces now turned their edge toward another. She heard fragments carried over the ranch fence, from children's chatter by the churchyard, from women who once turned their backs when she passed. But hearing was not believing. She still walked with her shoulders bent, the old habit of shame weighing them down. That morning Daniel mentioned he needed rope and salt from town. Miriam hesitated, but his gaze held hers. "Come along. Nothing to hide from." So simple, yet unshakable. she went. From the moment they stepped into the square, she felt the difference. Where once there had been laughter behind hands, there were now sidelong glances, hesitant, uneasy. The woman at the vegetable stall, who had once whispered loudest, merely straightened her carrots and nodded as Miriam passed. A group of wives by the well fell quiet, their looks stripped of scorn, shaded instead with something like reconsideration. Daniel kept close, his tall frame a shield at her side. When a gust blew rain across her face and caught her skirt, he shifted, blocking the wind. He said nothing, but his presence steadied her step. At the grain sellers, the man famous for his tongue spoke only the price, handed over the flour without remark. Miriam took it, throat tight. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated plainly, without suspicion, without judgment. Then a voice slurred from near the blacksmith's shop. A drunk, swaying, laughed harshly. "Look at that belly! Who knows whose it is?" The square froze. Heat rushed to Miriam's face, her legs nailed to the ground. But before shame could swell, Daniel stepped half a pace forward. His body blocked her completely, his eyes fixed on the man, cold, unflinching. No fist lifted, no word of threat, yet the drunk shrank back at once. No one laughed. No one joined in. The town had turned, and Miriam was no longer their sport. When Daniel returned to her side, he spoke no word. His hand rested on her shoulder, rough, scarred, steady. That touch alone spread warmth through her chest, enough to drown the chill and let her breathe full against the weight of watching eyes. They finished their errands. As Daniel spoke with the salt merchant, Miriam sat waiting. A little girl stumbled nearby, dropping her rag doll. Miriam bent quickly, brushed the mud from her dress, and set her back on her feet. The child smiled shyly, murmured thanks, and ran off. No one mocked. No one sneered. Just a small, ordinary moment. And to Miriam, it was a gift beyond measure. When they returned to the wagon, Daniel stowed the baskets, then looked at her. He said nothing, only met her eyes. In that silence, she knew he had seen it all. The tremor of her hands, the tears held back, the brief, unguarded smile. On the road home, the wagon wheels thudded over puddles. The town had once been a prison, where whispers could destroy a life. Today, the tide had shifted, and Miriam had walked its streets without bowing her head. Not because the world fully believed her, but because, for the first time, she did not walk alone. She glanced at Daniel. He sat straight, reins firm, calm as stone. Quietly, she edged her shoulder against his arm. He turned, surprised, then gave a small nod. That simple gesture warmed her more than any comfort spoken aloud. And in the rhythm of wheels carrying them back to Holt Ranch, Miriam felt the stir of something new, not just in the town's changing tongue, but in her own breath, at last moving in step with the steady beat of a home. Spring swept across the prairie, green shoots gleaming with dew beneath the morning sun. Miriam stepped onto the porch of Holt Ranch and drew in a deep breath, her hands resting lightly over her belly, where a small life grew stronger each day. For the first time in years, she did not fear what lay ahead. The curses of the past had faded, leaving room for something fragile yet steadfast: faith. She began with little things. Behind the house, she started a garden. Once, she had never been allowed more than menial tasks. But here, Daniel did not forbid her. He stood nearby, sometimes hauling buckets of water, sometimes turning the soil with his own hands. Rows of beans, a few stalks of corn, carrots, onions, all rose beneath her care, living proof that something new could take root. Soon, children from town, many the sons and daughters of freed slaves, appeared at the gate. At first only 2 or 3, clutching scraps of wood for slates, their eyes wide and unsure. Miriam remembered her own childhood, how she had longed to hold a book without having it snatched away. She opened the door and welcomed them. The old granary became a classroom. The children sat on planks propped across crates. Daniel had found an abandoned blackboard in town, scarred and chipped, and carried it home. Miriam wrote letters carefully, her voice steady, and the children's faces lit like sunlight breaking through clouds. Daniel seldom joined, but most evenings he came. He sawed, hammered, built rough tables and benches from pine boards, sweat darkening his shirt. Miriam often watched, the words of gratitude rising but catching in her throat. When her strength faltered, Daniel's hand would rest briefly on her shoulder, rough, solid, speaking more than thanks or comfort. In time, the town's gaze shifted. Miriam, once branded barren well, was now the woman who gave children their letters. Daniel, known for his silence and distance, was seen steady at her side, lending his strength. Where there had been whispers, now there were nods. Some parents even sent their own children to her door. One evening, as the sun sank beyond the ridge, the last pupils ran home clutching their slates. Miriam stayed behind to tidy the room, her hands trembling with fatigue. Daniel came in quietly, set a cup of water before her, and sat down. His eyes lingered on her, no longer only patient, but edged with pride. "You've done more than you ever thought you could," he said simply. Miriam paused, then smiled. His words, plain as he was, filled her like a hymn. The town began to change. Women who once crossed the street now greeted her kindly. At the market, her name was spoken with respect. Children chattered about Mrs. Holt who teaches letters. At church, when she and Daniel walked in, they were no longer subjects of ridicule, but a couple quietly honored, not for speeches, but for the way they lived. A woman who rose from ashes, and a man who held her steady. One night, the garden smelled sweet with bean blossoms. Miriam sat on the porch, watching children scatter home, while Daniel bent over a workbench in the fading light, his silhouette cut against a red horizon. Miriam laid her hand on her belly and smiled. For the first time in years, faith no longer felt like a luxury. Later, with the fire glowing in the hearth, Daniel sat beside her. They watched the flames without speaking. Miriam turned, her eyes softened by the light. "I never thought I could live like this," she whispered. Daniel only nodded, his hand closing around hers. No speeches, no vows. The grip was enough to say, this home, this life, was truly theirs. And so, in a land once thick with cruel tongues, Miriam learned a quiet truth, that what a soul needs most is not the world's approval, but one steady hand at your shoulder, and a place where such a hand can mean home. That year, the harvest came early. The fields around Holt Ranch glowed gold with ripened wheat, the air heavy with the scent of roasted corn and pumpkin. Townsfolk gathered in the wide yard where Daniel had set long tables draped in rough cloth, piled high with bread, vegetables, and barrels of sharp apple cider. Lanterns swung above, their light spilling over every face, wrapping the gathering in a rare warmth. Miriam stood at the porch, hands resting gently on her growing belly. Her hair was pinned back, a few strands falling loose along her cheeks, firelight softening her quiet beauty. Children darted past, tugging her into their circle of dance. She shook her head, smiling, her eyes bright with unspoken gratitude. No longer did eyes follow her with scorn. Women who once whispered behind her now pressed cakes into her hands, offered blessings, asked after her health. Daniel moved among the crowd, shaking hands, checking the cider casks. Tall and steady as ever, but Miriam caught the ease in his eyes, the rare peace upon his face. When night deepened, the music and chatter hushed. Neighbors gathered in the center yard, waiting for their host to speak. Daniel stepped forward, shoulders broad, as if to bear the weight of every gaze. His voice rose low and even, carrying over the hush. "They said I took a wife to settle a debt," he began, his mouth tightening as if tasting the bitterness of old gossip. Some laughed, saying I only needed a pair of hands for work. But the truth is, he paused, his eyes seeking Miriam at the edge of the table. "I gained far more than that." His breath came deep, his words gravelly but certain. "I gained someone stronger than any storm, someone who bore what no one should have to bear, and yet still stood, bringing life back to this land, back to me." A ripple moved through the crowd. Heads nodded. A few women dabbed at their eyes. Miriam stood frozen, lips trembling. Never had she heard such words. Never had anyone named her strong. She had known only scorn, the names that bound her in chains. Daniel turned fully toward her, and then, to the astonishment of all, he bent to one knee. No golden ring, no roses, only his hand pressed over his chest, proof of the only pledge that mattered. "If you'll have it," he said, his voice dropping low, meant for her yet clear in the silence, "I'll walk beside you the rest of my days." The night held still. Even the crickets hushed. Miriam's vision blurred as tears broke loose, hot down her cheeks. Before everyone, Daniel had chosen her, not out of debt, not out of duty, but because she was herself. She stepped forward, slow as though in a dream. Daniel remained kneeling, his gaze steady, stripped of pride or pretense. Miriam bent toward him, shoulders trembling. Tears fell, yet her lips curved into a smile she had never dared wear. She nodded. Once small, then again stronger. She reached out her hands for his, and he caught them firm. The crowd erupted. Cheers, clapping, laughter rising like a tide. But Miriam heard only the thunder of her own heart. For the first time, she had been chosen. Not as a bargain, not as a burden, but as a woman worthy of love, seen for her own strength. Daniel rose, not kissing her before the crowd, only holding her hand with all his strength. Yet the look they shared, deep, trembling, complete, was more intimate than any kiss. And in the harvest fire's glow, in the roar of voices around them, Miriam felt the sky itself opening wide above her. A year had passed since that harvest night, when Daniel had bent one knee before all the town, hand pressed to his chest, no ring, no flowers, only truth. From that evening on, Holt Ranch was no longer the same. Spring returned, carrying the damp scent of earth and the chatter of birds in the hedgerows. Warm winds softened memories once sharpened by cold. The wooden door creaked in the morning sun, and from within came the soft laugh of an infant, thin, unsteady, yet enough to fill a house long accustomed to silence. Miriam held the child close, a small life with dark, bright eyes like hers, yet solemn as his father. She rocked on the chair by the window, sunlight spilling across the baby's face. Tiny fingers clutched her dress as if to never let go. She kissed the child's brow, overcome by the fragile yet fierce truth that she was no longer the empty vessel, cursed in whispers years past. Daniel entered from the stables, shoulders broad as ever, though his gait now slower, not from age, but from weight. Responsibility had shifted from land and stock to the home behind him. He stripped his gloves, washed his hands in the basin, and came to lay one calloused hand on Miriam's shoulder. No words were needed. The touch alone wrapped her in safety. That day, Daniel saddled a horse for a rare ride together. Miriam wrapped herself in a shawl, the child secured in her arms, while Daniel lifted her to the saddle with steady care. He mounted behind, one hand on the reins, the other circling them both. The baby rested against Miriam's chest, breathing softly. The horse moved slow through the wide meadow. Evening light poured gold over the fields, wind carrying the sweet scent of grass. Far off, the sky burned red as melted honey, casting fire across hills and young wheat. Miriam leaned back into Daniel's chest, hearing his heartbeat steady and strong. Together, the three formed a quiet circle, sturdy, simple, whole. The child was too young to laugh aloud, yet Miriam heard it in her mind. The patter of feet in tall grass, the shout of Papa, the ringing giggle of a tumble and rise again. All of it, a promise of days no longer hollow. Eyes closed, arms tight around her child, Miriam thought, "They once called me empty. Now I am full. Not to prove anything to the world, not to silence old voices, but because she had learned she was worthy of love and of giving it." Daniel bent his head until his cheek brushed her hair. The gesture, plain and unspoken, held more vow than any words could. Their beginning had not been choice. Miriam was thrust into his hands like a debt, and he had accepted her as such. Yet through silence, through small gifts and steady glances, through every hand laid on a shoulder without judgment, they had chosen each other, again and again. On the hill above the meadow, with sunset burning red as copper, Miriam turned to him. In his eyes, she saw more than a man. She saw a home, the peace she had thought forever beyond reach. The child stirred and whimpered, then drifted back to sleep. Miriam kissed the small brow, tears brimming. In that moment, she knew, love does not always begin with choice, but it endures through the choices to remain. Season after season, wound after wound, silence after silence. The spring wind swept the golden dust of barley into the fading sky. Against that glow, a man, a woman, and a child on horseback became a living painting. They needed no approval from the world. They needed only each other to carry on their new beginning. Some loves are not born of choice, but grow because two souls choose again and again to stay. Miriam and Daniel's story is a reminder that happiness is not loud. It may be found in a glance, in a touch, in the simple knowledge that one has finally come home. If this tale stirred your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you can journey with us through the next of these Wild West love stories.